I remember very clearly. It was 2000, and I was looking for another film to make. I was sort of doing just as you do a bunch of research into possible stories and reading a bunch of articles and books and just talking to people and was having a conversation with my uncle Ian, and so Ian had done some writing with the Pram Factory, a theatre company in the late '60s, and had written a couple of pieces for Jack Charles. And Jack was always a kind of a mythical figure growing up. He was a family friend, so my mum met him when she was, I think, 16. He wasn't around very much, but he was always just someone you'd sort of hear stories about, or occasionally hear stories of this.
What stories were you hearing?
So the stories were that there was this pretty chaotic but remarkably talented figure who was not only a cat burglar but also an amazing stage performer and actor for screen, who had very tragically developed a pretty heavy heroin addiction and had become homeless, really, and spent a lot of time in prison. So I asked my uncle and aunt to try to help me track him down. And at that point, Jack was actually living up in Sydney. He was living in a squat with, do you remember that serial pest who was going around, doing a whole bunch of public events?
Peter?
That's right.
What's his surname? We'll figure it out. But
yeah, so somehow Jack Charles found...
The horse race?
Yep. So Jack Charles found himself living in a squat with this guy.
I've never heard this story, and that's such a wonderful combination of people.
and apparently this guy was just like rubbing everyone the absolute fucking wrong way in this squat. And something went very pear-shaped. I don't know the exact details, but the squat ended up being firebombed because of either Peter or maybe someone else. So anyway, Jack had just kind of escaped Sydney and had come back down to Melbourne. So it was perfect timing. We organised... I don't know how it even happened because Jack certainly didn't have a mobile phone or a house. So I think we somehow got a message to him, organised a meeting in a cafe on Brunswick Street. I remember bringing my camera. I didn't quite know what was going to happen. I remember being quite nervous. I was only 21 at the time and Jack was 58. And we sat down, bought Jack a coffee. He started speaking straight away, launching into his life story, just starting pretty much from the beginning. So from the his story of him being taken at 10 weeks old from his mother. So
just for those that don't know, can you just illustrate what he looked like when you first saw him, and how did that marry with your the myth that you'd constructed in your head?
So Jack is a diminutive and yet somehow larger than life figure all at once. He's, I would say, how tall is he? He's quite a small gentleman, but that's like outweighed by his enormous grey afro and enormous beard. And I remember that the first thing that really struck me about him was, even in that first meeting, there was an affability and an openness and a kind of a leaning into even the smallest of human interactions that I would learn later was really such a key part of his personality. And the thing that in some ways influenced me the most about Jack, which is his equanimity, and whether it was him dealing with his closest, oldest friend who he'd known for 40 years or a bus driver that he'd just met that afternoon, there was the same degree of warmth, of willingness to connect. And I over the years that we worked together, in some ways that more than anything else is really what I took on board, as a human being, just that that endless ability to lean into any interaction and see the good in it and the potential in it, and the worth, and for that reason, I think Jack is probably has more friends and knows more people as a nearly 78. So he's a 78-year-old than anyone I've ever met. So basically he just started talking, and after about 3 minutes he's like, "Are you going to start filming me? Are we going to start this?" Okay, fine. I took my camera out. We started recording, did a 40-minute interview then and there. And then he, at the end of the interview, he was kind of umming and ahhing for a second and wasn't quite sure what was going on. He said, "Oh, if you could maybe spot me a 50, that'd be great. Just need to get a few things, and I'm just running a bit short at this moment." So I was like, "Yeah, it's fine. Here's $50." And from the outset, he was really, really adamant about wanting this film to be, as in his words, a warts and all portrayal of what his life was at that point in time, which was, he was sleeping under bridges, in laundries, occasionally crashing with friends and family, but that was like very occasional. And so it was homeless, and basically he was on a pretty hot streak of committing these burglaries. So he would basically, he targeted predominantly the eastern suburbs, so the inner east. So he'd do Kew, Hawthorne, Toorak, South Yarra, and he'd been basically, as he would call it, collecting the rent from these houses and mansions.
For people that don't live in Melbourne, can you just talk about like the significance of that area and why he targeted that area?
Yeah, so basically, in the south side across the Yarra, there's an amazing story actually. Shelton Lee, this poet friend of Jack's, told me that during the Depression in Melbourne, there were plans afoot, very serious plans, to actually blow up the bridges connecting the north and the south, because there was this very real fear that the working class in suburbs like Richmond, that were still populating from the turn of the century, the workers' cottages and that part of Melbourne, the unwashed hordes were going to cross the Yarra and invade the wealthy neck of the woods, being South Yarra, Hawthorne, Kew. So it's really where you get the most ridiculously obscene mansions in Melbourne, to put it bluntly. And Jack had walked those streets and robbed, literally, I would say, that like some houses he'd robbed like 10 or 12 times. So to say that he'd committed thousands of robberies sounds absurd, but over a 20, 30-year period, it's like probably a pretty conservative estimate. Just he was arrested about a year into us filming together, and even on that single arrest, I think they had him on upwards of 100 robberies. But sometimes the cops would, and for better or worse, that they would just clean up their books with Jack. So they'd arrest him, and he would basically just say yes to anything they threw at him, knowing that it helped them, and they would kind of be somewhat lenient on him as a result. But sometimes he'd cop a charge for 150 either straight burglaries, and then occasionally he would get charges of aggravated burglary, which are obviously a bit more serious. But he really was like an old school cat burglar, though. So one of his specialties was breaking into people's houses when they were asleep and in the house. He used to tell me these amazing stories of synchronizing his breath with the breath of the people sleeping in the bedroom that he was in, and it would sometimes take him 20 minutes to crawl across the floor to get to a jewelry bowl or a chest of drawers, and would take him sometimes up to an hour to get in and out of a single room. So he actually saw it sometimes as a performance of sorts. So he really loved it. He loved robbing people.